Hello everyone, welcome back to another video learning Windows PowerShell in our channel Telugulo Telusko. In this video we are going to talk about PowerShell remoting. So one of the coolest features in Windows PowerShell is the ability to connect to a remote machine and execute some tasks. So there are a lot of complexities in terms of dealing with this particular feature, and we are going to explore every bit of it. So let's get started to understand what exactly a PowerShell remoting is. So before we understand the concepts of PowerShell remoting, in basic terms, let's understand what a remoting is all about. So as an administrator, you are trying to connect to a server which is hosted in your data center, and you are trying to establish a connection to that particular server and perform some tasks, right? Traditionally, if you use RDP to connect to your Windows server which is available in your data center, you would have been very familiar with how to connect remotely to a particular server. And then if you are from a Linux or Unix background, it is pretty much the same as you think about shell or establishing a connection using a putty or something. So basically, the idea behind this particular PowerShell remoting is the ability to connect to a remote machine. And now we are going to talk about some of the complexities in this particular remoting part. So let's understand a couple of things. What is a remoting first of all, and then how to enable remoting. You can enable remoting via multiple different ways, and we are going to essentially talk about the PowerShell way of doing things, and also how to enable PowerShell remoting using group policy on a machine. And we are going to cover a couple of different topics during this module, and then we are going to talk about temporary and persistent sessions. So there are two different ways of creating a session to a remote machine, which is a temporary copy of PowerShell which executes whatever you ask to do, and then a persistent copy which always stays there waiting for instructions and commands to be passed. And then we'll talk about a concept called implicit remoting. And then we are going to look at how the session configuration is going to work in PowerShell. So session configurations are not new to PowerShell. They exist from version 2, and we are going to talk about why and what they are going to actually used for. Finally, we'll talk about some of the jobs in PowerShell, which is remoting jobs, and with that we'll wrap up this session. So let's understand what a remoting is in a particular scenario. So you are an administrator for your organization. You're sitting at your office location on your client machine. So this is running somewhere Windows 10, for example, and you have a data center where your company hosts all the servers in a particular data center. Now, as an administrator, your responsibility is to manage these systems, right? Manage these systems. Now, it's not really possible to connect to go to the data center and manage these servers all the times. So traditionally we use some things like RDP, remote desktop protocols, and then we used command prompts to trigger commands using the PSEXE utilities and all the stuff. These things still exist and these things still work, so there is nothing that's stopping you to do this old way of doing things. But when you talk about automation, right? When you talk about automation, it's all about doing multiple things at the same time. So that's what makes PowerShell really powerful, right? Sitting at your particular machine right here as an administrator, you can establish a remote connection to all the servers at the same time. You can pass instructions, you can pass commands to be executed, and once they get executed on these particular machines, you get the data back on your machine with which you can actually play with. And there are a couple of caveats there. We are going to talk about the common gotcha scenarios where you can run into when you are dealing with PowerShell remoting, and we will cover those. But now understand that couple of things. Remoting is all about connecting to a machine which is at least not your computer, maybe the machine next to your computer, or the machine which is in the data center, whatever it is. So remoting can work in two different ways, which is one to one, or remoting can be one to many servers at the same time. So you connect to multiple different machines at the same time. So remoting can be one-to-one and one-to-many. So there are a couple of different ways or techniques that you can use to establish this remote sessions, and we are going to talk about one by one. We're going to talk about one by one. So now that said, let's understand in general, in theory, what a remoting is all about. So in PowerShell, you can run remoting commands on a single computer or multiple computers by using temporary and persistent sessions. So what exactly is a temporary session? So you are sitting right here and the server is right here, and you ask the server to do something, it does, and so it does by launching a copy of PowerShell, executes the action, sends the results back onto your machine, and this PowerShell copy is closed. This PowerShell copy is closed. These are temporary sessions. These are temporary sessions. So whenever you want to spin up a session, you pause or you say some command to be executed onto the remote machine, and the remote machine executes that, and the session gets terminated after the execution is completed. So this is a temporary session. And about a persistent session, you are an administrator sitting right here on your client. There are a couple of servers, or a single server for that matter, any server. Now you create a persistent session. Which means you open up a copy of PowerShell on this particular machine, and this machine is waiting for your instructions. So you send one command, it executes, it returns the output back onto your console, and the PowerShell window on this machine is not going to be closed. It's going to stay persistent, which means it's going to stay as long as the timeout limit is reached. There is a timeout limit which is set by default, which is somewhere close to 60,000 milliseconds, I believe. So if you are not passing any commands during this time frame, then the PowerShell copy will close. If not, it will wait for the instructions to be passed. So after some time, after a couple of minutes, you send one more command. So the same command will be executed in the same PowerShell console, because this will not get closed. This will not get closed as the temporary sessions does. So these are called persistent sessions. A persistent session is nothing but you open a copy of PowerShell on the remote machine, and the remote machine keeps that copy open and waits for the command. You pass a command, it gets executed. You pass one more command, it executed in the same shell. One more, it gets executed in the same shell. If you are not passing any commands for a period of this default timeout limit, then the PowerShell copy is going to be closed. So this is a persistent session. And then if we talk about remoting, you can also start an interactive remoting session with a single computer. This is nothing but one-to-one connection. In a one-to-one connection scenario, you connect directly to a copy of PowerShell on the remote machine. So whatever you do gets executed on this remote machine directly. So this looks very much familiar to people coming from Unix or Linux background who are using a putty or something to connect to the console session on a particular server. It gives a similar kind of feeling, but technically it's not the same, but it has some theory of operations behind the scenes which PowerShell can do for you. And then this example is irrelevant, and then we are going to skip that. Now we are going to talk about the live action about the group policy, and we'll start about beginning where how we can enable remoting. Before we can enable remoting, there is important point I want to make though. By default, remoting is disabled on all client machines. So which means the Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. So remoting is disabled by default. There is no remoting enabled by default on these machines, which means whenever you install an operating system, the PowerShell remoting is disabled by default on these machines. Now on the other hand, when it comes to the server operating systems, remoting is enabled by default on 2012 servers and above. 2012 servers and above. So if you are running 2008 or 2008 R2, you still need to enable PowerShell remoting. You still need to enable PowerShell remoting. So that's one thing you need to really understand. Now, with that said, so there are a couple of different ways you can enable remoting, right? You can enable remoting via GPO, the group policy object. So this is useful if you want to enable remoting on multiple machines at once, right? Because you cannot go to each and individual machines and execute a command to actually enable remoting on all the 1000 or 1500 machines that you have on your network. And the other way of enable remoting is using a command which is enable PS remoting. Enable PS remoting. So this, when you run this particular command on a copy of PowerShell, this particular command is going to enable remoting on those server. So when you say enable remoting, what is the things that are happening in the background? So let's launch quickly a copy of PowerShell and then say enable remoting and see what exactly it does. So PowerShell gives you a detailed description of what it does and how it's going to work, and what are some of the common things that you need to know. So I have PowerShell remoting enabled by default on this machine, so it did not return any output, I believe. So let's disable the remoting first. So disabling the remoting is going to do all these things. Now let's do an enable remoting to see if it's going to give me the same output back. Like, what are the steps that it's doing in the background to set up the PowerShell remoting on my machine? I don't see anything popping up. So let's actually copy these things and put it in a notepad, and we can discuss one by one the step-by-step procedures that are happening when you're executing this particular command. First of all, the first thing that happens when you enable remoting is it is going to stop and disable the enable service, which means this is when you are stopping it, but when you are starting is the action is opposite, right? So it's going to start and restart if the WinRM service is already started. So now let's talk about WinRM service. Traditionally, there are two types of remoting in Windows PowerShell. One which is OS native, and the other one is the PowerShell remoting. So what is the difference? The difference between these two things is the protocols that they use. So typically when you see a command like get service which supports computer name parameter, where you can trigger multiple computer names and retrieve the list of services. These are OS native remotings, which means for these commands to be executed on a remote machine, you doesn't need to have a PowerShell copy or a PowerShell installed on those machines, and this works under RPC protocol, the remote procedure call protocol. These are called the OS native remotings. And the PowerShell remoting, on the other hand, works on a protocol called WSMAN, Web Services for Management Host, right? WSMAN protocol. So in Windows, a particular service, WinRM, Windows Remote Management, is a service which implements this protocol. Now let's understand what I mean by this. Let's say if I have a computer and I have one more computer here. Let's imagine that there is no PowerShell. PowerShell is not there on this machine. So from this particular machine, I can trigger OS native commands. So how can you identify an OS native command? An OS native command is a commandlet which supports the computer name parameter. So we'll understand what it means in a couple of minutes. So when you say get service computer name, and if you give multiple computer names like localhost, DC comma W Win7 comma something like this. Now this command is getting executed on these three machines and getting the output back onto my console, So for this command to work, let's say if this is a Win7 machine and it doesn't have any PowerShell installed on this particular computer. Though there is no PowerShell available on this particular machine, I will be still able to run this command on this particular machine, because technically this is not using PowerShell remoting. But this is using something called as operating system native remoting, which works on remote procedure calls. So on the other hand, we have something called as PowerShell remoting. For this to work, you need to have PowerShell installed on the remote machines. So you open up a copy of PowerShell here and you trigger a command to the remote machine. Then it runs in this PowerShell instance and returns the output back to your console. Onto the console. This needs PowerShell. So how do you identify a commandlet which is PowerShell remoting enabled? Yeah, you can use the dash session parameter as a reference. If any commandlet actually supports dash session parameter, it is typically using PowerShell remoting. There are some commandlets which supports both computer name and dash session parameter. These are typically using remoting, PowerShell PS remoting. For these commands to work, you need to have PowerShell installed on the remote machine, and the remoting is enabled, and also all the necessary ports and protocols and the exceptions are met. So now, so when you run enable PS remoting, so what it's gonna do, it's gonna start the service, start the WinRM, or restart the WinRM service if it is already started. It's going to start the WinRM service and then create. So this creates a listener request on an IP address, and then it enables firewall rules for WS management communications, and then it adds some kind of permissions who can connect to that particular machine. By default, all people who are local admins on a remote machine can connect to that particular computer. By default, remoting allows all local administrators on that particular machine to get connected to the remote computer. So this is how you enable, using one command on the remote machine, to actually enable remoting. But what if you want to do it multiple times? Now we understood the couple of things, right? So for the PowerShell remoting to work, first the WinRM service need to be started. The WinRM service need to be started. Second, firewall rules need to be created. On that machine. Third thing is you need to have the permissions assigned. Right? So these are the three things you need to keep in mind. Now let's understand how do I actually do the enablement of PowerShell remoting using group policy management, because group policy management comes in handy if in case you want to enable remoting on multiple machines, like 1000 machines or 2000 machines. You can't go to each and every machine and type enable PS remoting. It is a manual labor. So probably the best idea is to go through the group policy management console, and then you can actually create a group policy object to actually trigger things on the machines. So let's say if I take the default group policy object and I click edit. So again, we need to follow the same things, right? You need to actually you need to enable the firewall exceptions, and you need to enable the WinRM service to accept requests. So first of all, let's see how to enable WinRM request. So you go to computer configurations, policies, and then administrative templates, and then we go to Windows components, and then we'll go to, let me just maximize these, and we'll go to something called as Windows remote management, this one, and then we'll go to WinRM service, and you need to allow this particular service, allow remote server management through WinRM. So this is one of the services that you need to enable to ensure that the WinRM service is started on those machines. So now once the WinRM service is started, you need to ensure that you make the firewall exceptions that are needed for the traffic to flow in to that remote machine. So to enable firewall exceptions, you will go to policies, administrative templates, and then network, and then you will go to network connections. Network connections right here, and then Windows firewall. Go to domain profile. In domain profile, you are going to add some exceptions. You need to define inbound port exceptions. Defined inbound port exceptions right here. So you enable this policy, you need to add some port exceptions. So now we'll talk about the ports. By default, PowerShell Remoting uses two ports, 5985 and then 5986. 5985 is for HTTP, and then 5986 is for HTTPS, right? Secure traffic. So you can enable both the ports. You can add exceptions for both those ports, and then you can configure this policy, and you can push this policy to your client so that PowerShell Remoting gets enabled on that particular machines. Now, enough of little theory. Let's play with the PowerShell and see how this remoting thing actually works. So first of all, when you enable PS remoting, the configuration of that particular remoting gets stored in something called as WSMan drive. So if you want to see about the configuration of your remoting, you can go to WSMan drive. In WSMan drive, currently you will have a connection to the local host, because this is where you actually your remoting is enabled. So you can navigate to CD localhost and then do an ls, and then you can see that there is an information about the service. So you can go to CD service to see about the WSMan service, and then do an ls to get the child items. So as you can see here, this is the root SDDL. This is a security descriptive language, right? Which means who are allowed to connect to my machines remotely. This is a security descriptor language, which is essentially the permissions, right? The permissions for a particular group, or permissions for a particular user, and so on, is represented in this format. And then max concurrent operations, how many number of concurrent operations can be executed by this PowerShell. And then we're gonna talk about enumeration timeouts here, and then we have some default ports which I want to take a look here, right here, the default ports. So when something says a container is like a folder, it has sub items to check. But when something says system.string or something, this is kind of a file where you can change this information, but you cannot go into it. It doesn't have any child like subfolders or something that you can look at. So this is the end of this particular path. You cannot go inside it. But when something says container, you can do cd container or cd auth. So let's talk about default ports. If I say default ports, currently there are 5985 for HTTP, as I said, and HTTPS is 5986. And then we'll talk about authorization. So if you see yes, auth, if I step back and go to cd auth. So auth talks about the protocols that you can use for PowerShell remoting. So currently I'm running on 2019, so the basic authentication is by default turned off. But if you're running on 2012 or something, you might have seen this default authentication, the basic authentication is set to true. but by default PowerShell uses something called as Kerberos authentication in a domain environment. Kerberos authentication in a domain environment. And there are other protocols that you can make use of. Negotiate, certificate, which uses SSL to enable authentication. And then we have cred SSP. This cred SSP is actually used some in environments to actually get rid of the double hop, the credential double hop problems. So that is set to false at there. And then CVD hardening level is set to relax. So we'll talk about that at a later point of time. So these are some of the protocols that are available for you with PowerShell remoting. Basic, Kerberos, negotiate, certificate, cred SSP, and the CVD hardening level. Now, if what else we can talk about here? We talked about our default port. We talked about authorizations. And then we talked about root, SDDL, max, concurrent corrections, and this is the maximum number of connections. So it can allow 300 connections at the same time to this PowerShell copy. And then allow unencrypted, which is set to false. So which means you're not allowing allowing unencrypted encrypted only encrypted traffic and not unencrypted traffic. And you have a certificate thumbprint and allow remote access. So this is the WSMan drive. So the WSMan drive essentially talks about all the all the default configuration that is stored on that particular machine for remoting, only for remoting perspective. So if you see here, there is a max timeout which is default to 60,000 milliseconds. So as I said before, when you're making a persistent connection, which means you're making a connection to a remote machine. On this remote machine, you are opening a copy of PowerShell, and you passed one command, and it executed and it sent the output back to you. But this PowerShell session is not going to be closed. It will wait. It will wait till this timeout. Before this timeout encounters, if you are not passing the next command to this PowerShell console, then this PowerShell console or the session will close. As long as it not hitting this timeout limit, the session stays persistent, and you can make use of the same session again and again and again. So that's pretty much about the WSMan drive. Now, PowerShell remoting one-to-one. Let's talk about PowerShell remoting one-to-one. So from one machine, I want to connect to another machine. How this is gonna work? So we are going to, first of all, as we are learning a new technology, like a new feature in PowerShell, it is always wise for us to actually see if there are any commandlets using get command noun remoting, right? So remoting says it has only two things: enable PS remoting and disable PS remoting. It's pretty straightforward. Enable enables the remoting on the machine, disable will disable it. I want to introduce a couple of new commands to you. So cd ccom. Now let's understand one-to-one scenario. So if I want to make a connection to a remote machine, I will use a commandlet called enter ps session. Enter ps session is a commandlet which is used to create an interactive session to a remote machine, which means I am sitting on this machine right now. There is one more remote machine somewhere else. This is somewhere else. Now I open a copy of PowerShell on my console. I type enter ps session. Let's say this computer name is DC. Enter ps session DC. Then what happens is this PowerShell console is going to directly connect to that machine and spin up a copy of PowerShell, and I'm connected now to this copy of PowerShell on this remote machine DC. So this is a one-to-one connection, a persistent connection that I'm making. So whatever commands that I type here, literally I'm typing on this particular PowerShell console and executing this action. So that's what enter ps session generally does. So now let's go and read the help file for enter ps session what it does, because it's really important to understand what exactly a commandlet does before you start interacting with that commandlet. So enter PS session gets me a huge list. Enter PS session gets me a huge list with some of the examples, parameter sets, parameters, and go on. So a lot of information. So if I want to use enter PS session, I can specify a computer name, and this is a mandatory parameter. As you can see, the parameter and string is not in a square brackets together, so it's a mandatory parameter. So I want to specify a computer name in a string format. So now I understand that okay, it accepts a computer name, but that's fine. So let's say currently I'm on a machine called DC. Now I want to do enter PS session to a host called ADFS01. Yep, as you can see now, I'm currently connected to ADFS01. So now I'm interacting with that particular machine on my network. So if I say host name once again, I get ADFS01. Now as you can clearly see, I started with the domain controller. Now currently I'm on an ADFS01 server. So if I say get service, this is a commandlet that I'm triggering or running on the PowerShell console on the remote machine. So I get the output back. So for this is one-to-one remoting. When you want to close the remoting session, as you can see, the enter PS session is a keyword that you have used. Probably there might be some other commandlet which can actually deal with the PS session to be closed. So I say get noun and then PS session. Let's see what all the commandlets it has. So I have couple to play with. So I said enter PS session. So when I enter, I can also exit, right? So exit PS session is the commandlet to exit. I have couple more new PS session, and then we have disable PS session configuration, disconnect PS session, and these all stuff, and we are going to talk about them in the following part. So now exit PS session is going to exit from the session. Now I'm back onto my local machine. As you can see, the prompt clearly says currently I came back to my local machine, and when I run this commandlet, there we go, I'm back on domain controller. This is one-to-one, pretty straightforward. Let's make another connection to enter PS session. I need to type to an extent at least it can recognize. Computer name is web server. So this computer name parameter is positional, which means you can type it or you can just say web server. This is a positional parameter, so you don't need to specify dash computer name. So for this to work, right, for these things to work, you need your whatever the account that I'm using right now to run this PowerShell copy should be a member of local administrator group on these servers. If not, I will be not able to establish a remote connection. That is really important to understand. Now as you can see, I'm connected to a web server on my network, so that's a different computer. And then I say exit PS session to exit out of it. What I cannot do is this: enter PS session hyphen computer name ADFS01 comma web server. Boom, I got an error right away, because as you can see here, I cannot use enter PS session to connect to multiple computers at the same time. That doesn't make really sense, because I'm establishing something called as a persistent session to a remote machine. So I cannot make persistent sessions at the same time to multiple different computers. That is not possible. That is not really possible. So enter PS session is always one-to-one. Keep that in your mind. And now let's talk about how to establish. This is useful but not really that useful, because I can't do anything on multiple machines at the same time. not do multiple things at the same time. That is the power of automation, doing multiple different things on multiple different computers at the same time, sitting at your single computer. That's what makes PowerShell really powerful. So now we are going to talk about how to make multiple sessions to a remote machine. So there is another command which I want to introduce here, which is invoke dash command. So an invoke command is designed to actually trigger one to many connections. So which means using this command I can send a thing that need to be executed. This is called a script block. A script block opens in a curly brace and closes with the curly brace. I put the command that I want to execute here, and then I will pass it to multiple computers. So let's see what exactly it looks like. So invoke command. So as we are learning again a new command, I emphasize to actually read the help file. I emphasize always to read the help file. Get command, computer name, get command, get help, the command name, and then dash full parameter to read the full help. So lots of information, tons of information to read. So here we go, and various different parameter sets that I can actually use. You can use invoke command, as you can see here, to specify a computer name. It accepts strings, and I can see that it can accept multiple strings. And then you will specify a script block, and in this script block you will type whatever the command you want to run. Invoke command is also accepting something called a sessions, PS session, and we'll talk about sessions in a while. And then invoke command can also actually take a file path, which means if you have a PowerShell script readily available to trigger to multiple different machines at the same time, you can use invoke command, give it a file path, and path to the file, the .ps1 file or whatever the file name is, and then trigger it to multiple computers using the dash computer name parameter. So that's something you can do. As you can see here, I can run as administrator, and I have various different parameter sets. There are some decent examples as well. That you can refer to within the help file documentation without going to the actual search engines or something. You can see invoke command, file path, give the file of the script file that you want to execute on the remote machine, and then give the computer names. You can give multiples. Again, you can use alternative credentials. For example, if you have opened this PowerShell copy with someone who doesn't have admin privileges on those machines, because in some organizations they follow the principle of least privilege concepts. So for what normal admin works, you use normal user account. For privileged tasks that you want to use, you will use an admin account. So if you have opened the PowerShell copy with a normal user account, but if you want to trigger this action, and if you want to trigger that using your admin credentials, you can specify an alternate credentials using the credential parameter. And then in the script block, you type the command whatever you want to type and pass on to the remote machine. So that is absolutely possible. And then there are a couple of different examples which we will talk about at a later point of time, because I don't want to make things all at a time flowing. So invoke command, great. Now I understood that invoke command can accept multiple computer names. So I can give it a couple of computer names like ADFS01, and I can give it a web server, and I can give it a DC. So there are 3 different computers right now. And then I'll give a script block. In this script block, a script block always goes in open and closed parenthesis, and in this parenthesis you are going to curly braces. In this curly brace you are going to give the command that you want to get executed. For example, get dash service. This command is now being sent to 3 different computers: ADFS01, web server, DC. 3 different computers. So when I hit the return key, there we go. As you can see here, it clearly states these are the services that came from DC. right? I can clearly see the distinction right there. And these are all from ADFS. These are all from ADFS, and if I scroll a little bit, they are from web servers. So I'm getting the information from multiple different computers at the same time. So this is really powerful, the invoke command, which can actually connect to multiple different computers at the same time, execute a specific action, and kind of get the output back onto your display, right? Super important. Invoke command. So invoke command is, again, as I said, it is a one-to-many. So you can connect to as many computers as you want. I don't think there is any specific limit as long as the number of concurrent sessions on the remote machine is not being crossed as per the specified limit in the WSMan drive. So in the WSMan drive, we did see that there is a number of concurrent connections limit. Somewhere it was set to 4,000 or something. So if you are crossing that limit, then there is a problem. But as long as you're not crossing that limit, that should be absolutely fine to connect to multiple different computers. Now, what we have seen so far is the native PowerShell remoting. So when I trigger this command, let's understand what the flow looks like. When I use invoke command. This is my machine, and I have 3 machines, which is ADFS, and then a web server, and then another machine, something DC or whatever it is. 3 machines. So using invoke command, I open up a copy of PowerShell on my machine, and I say invoke dash command, whatever the command it is. Now what exactly happening in the background is this command is actually packaged into something called as an XML packet, because right, WSMan works on HTTP and HTTPS. These are the web protocols. So I need some way to pass the information via these web protocols. So this commandlet is packaged or bundled into an XML packet, and it is sent across to all these 3 remoting machines, all these 3 targets. Now once this XML packet reaches right here, this PowerShell copy on the remote machine opens that XML packet, looks at this command, executes that command, and it produces something called as an output, right? So all 3 computers does the same thing. Creates an output. Now this output is then again converted into an XML packet, and that XML packet is sent back to this PowerShell engine, and then this PowerShell is going to open that output and construct the display as objects. We already discussed what is objects. So if you're not familiar with what is an object, just go back to my previous videos and just understand what is an object, so it makes more sense. So this is how the packet gets traveled over HTTP and HTTPS protocols to the remote machines, and it gets executing the output, and then we'll start seeing the display on the console. So now there are a couple of common mistakes or common errors that you might encounter. So when you are doing this invoke command kind of thing, as you know that the command gets packaged into an XML and travels across the remote machines, there is some loss of fidelity. So that you are going to lose some kind of functionality based on the output that you're getting back. So let me just describe what that means. So when I say get service and pipe it to get member, right? So get service is going to produce the list of services on my computer, and that information is being passed to get member as an input. Get member reads, analyzes the data, and tells me what type of data that I'm passing, and at the same time it's going to tell me what kind of methods and properties exist for that particular data type. As you can see here, the type of the object is system.service process.service controller, and there are a couple of different methods, right? Close, start, stop, so on and so forth. And there are some properties as well. But Now I have a problem right here, so let me just quickly launch a copy of PowerShell once again. And this, from this particular PowerShell, I do the same thing now. Invoke command to remote computers ADFS 01 and then web server, for example, two different servers, and then give it a script block and then say get service. So I'm doing the same thing, right? I'm running the get service commandlet on the remote machines. Now I want to see what are the members of that particular output is. So now what exactly is going to happen, this invoke command, computer name ADFS web server, and this script block which is get service, converted into an XML packet, and this XML packet is sent to two different machines, which is my ADFS server and the web server, right? Now this XML packet once get received on the remoting end, it opens that packet and reads this commandlet, spin up a copy of PowerShell, execute that instructions. They both does the same thing and produces something called as an output. Now this output is then again converted into an XML packet and sent across to my client machine, from where I triggered the action. Now when I open that XML and then read the data, what I'm expecting is these kinds of methods and properties for that particular information. But let's see what happens when I pipe that to get member. So get member says, boss, you got, so let's just see the difference by doing a side-by-side comparison maybe. Okay, so as you can see here, this is the remoting part, this is the remoting part, right? So as you can see here, I lost a lot of methods during the XML package transit that happened between to and fro between the multiple remote computers, right? So as you can see here, generally get service produces all this set of methods, but when I use invoke command, I kind of lose those methods. These get type and toString are standard methods that comes, so they exist, but I don't have the methods, so I have a problem there. I really have a problem. So you need to really keep in mind when you're dealing with remoting computers to actually get some kind of an output displayed on the console. But the properties still exist. As you can see, I can have all the properties: can pause, can shut down, container, so on and so forth. All the possible properties are available for me. The things that are missing right now is the methods, the alias properties and the events, which are actually part of the PowerShell local engine itself. So couple of things to note. So when you're using invoke command, you should always understand that you are going to lose some methods. Why this is important? For example, let's see, you have a service, a method called stop, but you did not get a method called stop right there. So now let's say if I'm doing invoke command get service and then name equals to bits on two different remote computers, I get the output as this. So I got two different remote computers telling me that the status of the bit service is stopped on this machine and the status on this particular machine is running. Now as we have learned the pipeline, I can pass this information to stop service. So when I actually did that, did it perform the action? I'm just wondering. As you can see here, the action is not performed. The state of this particular service is running because there are no methods that are produced. The stop method is not produced by this approach, so I'm not able to actually pipe that information to stop service. I'm wondering why it did not throw an error, and I want to use the verbose switch performing the operation stop service, but if I actually see if that particular service is stopped, it's actually not. So I'm going to lose some kind of fidelity in terms of how the remoting thing works. That's invoke command for you. Now as I've typed get command, now PS session, there are a couple of things that actually popped up. PS session, there are a couple of things that actually popped up, and I told I'll discuss that later. Now it's the time to discuss them. So we talked about enter PS session, we talked about exit PS session, we talked about all those two. So those two are actually completed, right? Those two are actually completed. This enter PS session is done, and then exit PS session is also done. Now what I want to talk about, a couple of things, is actually talking about the disconnecting part. We'll talk about disconnecting part. We'll talk about get PS session, which is important, new PS session, right? And then we'll talk about receive PS session, remove PS session, these things. Now so these covers the topic called persistent remoting. So far what we have done, let's understand, and then we'll move to the persistent remoting topic. So far what we have done in one-to-one or one-to-many is this. In one-to-one scenario, I'm connecting to a remote machine, right? I'm connecting to a remoting machine, and then executing. I open up a copy of PowerShell, execute things, and when I say exit PS session, this copy of PowerShell is closed, and I'm back to my local machine. This is one-to-one. And when I'm using one-to-many scenario, from this particular command, command PowerShell engine, I'm using invoke command to trigger a commandlet, and it travels over XML packet. It sends that XML packet to all three machines. These three machines opens a copy of PowerShell, execute the commandlet or whatever is there in the XML packet, and produces an output. The output is again packaged into XML, transferred to the local machine, and these PowerShell sessions are closed. So if you see here, in this scenario, if I say 100 times enters PS session, I'm going to open 100 PowerShell copies. Again, in this case, if I'm triggering 50 commands for one particular computer, so each computer is going to open 50 PowerShell copies to execute all those 50 commands one by one. So now there is certain amount of overhead in terms of opening a PowerShell, closing a PowerShell, keeping track of all those things. That's why we now move to a topic called as persistent sessions. This is again a one-to-many scenario. You can do for one-to-one or you can do for one-to-many. Now what happens is, on my PowerShell console, I tell PowerShell, so let's say this is DC, this is web, and this is ADFS. Now I say to my PowerShell copy, look, I want you to make a persistent connection to these three machines. I tell that using a specific syntax. Now PowerShell goes here and opens a copy of PowerShell on all these three machines when I tell that. Now what happens, these PowerShell copies wait for my instructions. Now I trigger a command to this machine, it executes and sends the output. But this PowerShell copy is not going to be closed. It's still going to wait. Every PowerShell copy is going to still wait for my instructions. As long as I'm sending the instructions, they are going to execute the commands in the same PowerShell console. If I am not sending any command for a default timeout period of 60,000 milliseconds, then these sessions get terminated. As long as I'm not hitting this default timeout value, these shells wait for my instructions on the remote machines. So what I'm avoiding by this scenario is, I can pass multiple commands to the same PowerShell session instead of spinning up new PowerShell copy every time. I'm actually relying on the same PowerShell session, so that I'm avoiding opening multiple copies of PowerShell. Now how do I do that? I do that, or we do that, or you do that using commandlet called new ps session. So when you are learning a new commandlet, again I emphasize to go to get help and read the full help of that particular commandlet. So let's go ahead and talk about what exactly it does. A new PS session is going to create a persistent session. As you can see here, the new PS session commandlet creates a Windows PowerShell session on a local or a remote computer. When you create a PS session, Windows PowerShell connection to the computer. Windows PowerShell establishes connection to the computer. Use a PS session to run multiple commands that share data such as function or the value of a variable. You can run commands on a remote computer without creating a PS session by using the computer name parameter of enter PS session or invoke command. When you specify a parameter, Windows PowerShell creates a temporary connection. So that is a way of doing temporary connections using the dash computer name parameter, and we already discussed. But now what we are going to do is we are going to use something called as sessions. So let's understand how it works. New PS session, new dash PS session, and PS session, and then I'll give a computer name ADFS01. ADFS01. Now you can see here I have a session opened, right? The ID of the session is 11. The name of the session is session 11. The remote machine that I'm connected or opened a session is for ADFS01. It's a remote machine. The state of the connection is open and it is available, ready to use. Now I can open another PS session, new PS session, to computer name web server. Now I have another session which is open for web server with ID number 12. The name of the session is session 12 and the computer name is web server. The remote machine, it is opened. Now what I did exactly right here, I'm sitting on this machine which is DC currently, and I opened sessions to two different remote machines, ADFS and web server. So which means I opened a copy of PowerShell on these two machines. Now these two PowerShell copies are waiting for my instructions, Now I can see the list of connections that I've opened using something called as get PS sessions. I need to type get PS session. So there we go. There are a couple of different sessions that I have opened, right? Session number 11 for ADFS01, session number 12 for web server. Now let's take this. Now if I want to actually connect to a particular session, or I can actually connect it using get PS session, or you can say it like this, enter PS session. So again, this is using 1-to-1 scenario. Instead of computer name, I will give in session. I will give the session. So what is the session option I need to give here? So let's go ahead and read the documentation of enter PS session. Enter PS session. PS session, and then full, or you can just say examples instead of full, just to retrieve the examples. You can see computer name, server name, computer name, server name, and then enter PS session and enter PS session. So there are no actual what you called the enter PS session example where you can use the session ID or session name. There is no such example right there. So let's do one thing. Let's read the parameter sets and understand what exactly it does. So let's go to the parameter set to see how this can be interpreted, because I want you to do this. Because you can get comfortable with the particular commandlet itself. Enter PS session. So let's scroll scroll up. So now let's say enter PS session with the session name can take PS session object. So let's do this. Enter PS session. So let's see, get PS session. Right, and then hit enter to get everything. So let's see, this is what? This is again a session object, right? You can pipe it to get member to see. Oops, not get masking set. It is get PS get member, yeah. So this is a run space dot PS session object. So let's do this. Get PS session hyphen computer name ADFS01. So I have this. Now I can say pipe it to enter PS session. There we go. Now if I connect it again, though there is a persistent session, I can use enter PS session only for one-to-one connections. If I want to use for one-to-many, I can do that in a different way. That is using the invoke command. So get PS session always connect to one particular machine. Enter PS session always connect to one particular machine. Now if I say exit PS session, previously what happened is the PowerShell copy is closed, but this time I am not closing the PowerShell copy. I can prove that just by going to get PS session one more time and then see that the ADFS server connection is still persistent and it is open and it is available. So I can again say enter PS session for ADFS01, right? There we go. Exit PS session. Sorry, it's exit PS session. Yeah. So I exited, get PS session to see what happened there because I executed a wrong command. PS session. So yeah, ADFS server is open. Similarly, I can do for web server. I can again say get PS session hyphen computer name and show me all the persistent sessions that I have for web server. Oops, web server. You have one. Okay, I can tell to connect to that by telling enter PS session. Now there we go. I am on the web server. I can exit PS session. There we go. I'm out. Now there is a trick though. You can do it by keeping them in a variable. $servers is equals to new PS session. That new PS session hyphen computer name ADFS01 web server. Hit enter. It says ooh, failed because I'm thinking I have a wrong name there. So now if I open servers, I have two different sessions that are stored in this variable at this point of time. Now let's do get PS session. I'll show you something really quick. PS session. Currently I have how many sessions? I have 5. Because first I created this 11 and 12. Then I created one more new PS session for ADFS01, and again I stored 2 more sessions in 15 and 16, which means potentially there are 3 copies of PowerShell which are now opened. 3 copies of PowerShell which are opened on ADFS server 01, and they are waiting for my instructions. On the web server I have 2. I have 2 copies of PowerShell. Open. So this is how technically the thing works, right? You can again make use of the dollar to connect, get enter something like invoke command. You can use that, and you can use the session thing as well. So if you want to remove all these PS sessions, you can do remove PS session PS session, and then you can give the ID, I believe ID number 16. ID number 16 is now removed, so get PS session doesn't list ID number 16. You can do one by one individually based on the ID numbers that is showed right here, or typically what you can do is get PS session, and then you can pipe that to remove PS session to potentially remove all the remoting sessions. Now if I say get PS session, I have nothing. Oops, get PS session, I have nothing. I have nothing, which means all the PowerShell copies on the remote machines are closed at this point. So that's how we can use sessions. Persistent sessions with enter PS session. Now I want to show you a trick for making it useful for multiple different commands. So I am saying servers is equal to new PS session, computer name ADFS01. So now I can see that get PS session is having two different what you call persistent connections to web server and ADFS01 servers. I can now say invoke command. So remember, invoke command is for multiple different computers. You can execute multiple things at the same time. So I can say session and then give $servers and then the script block. So I'm not using the dash computer name parameter at this point. I'm using something called a session parameter. So this session parameter allows me to use the variable where I stored multiple sessions, and then in the script block I can say get process, and hit the return key. So I'm expecting the process list should be out there. So as you can see here, from the web server I have the list of processes, and from the ADFS server as well. So that's how the sessions can be interpreted using what you called invoke command. So invoke command can do multiple things on multiple computers at the same time. Get PS session. So I have two again. So again, if I want to close them, I can say get PS session and then pipe it to remove PS session. This is again closing all the PowerShell copies on the remote machine, and super important to do that because you will end up creating a lot of sessions, and if you are just closing the PowerShell window like this, right, what happens is all those PowerShell copies need to wait until the 60,000 milliseconds timeout frame. So if you're not removing the sessions, for example, if you imagine you open 100 sessions to a machine, these 100 copies of PowerShell should wait till 60,000. So that is something like 100 into 60,000 milliseconds, and potentially they are using some memory and CPU, so you might see some performance issues. So that's one of the reasons that you use remove PS session. Now let's talk about something called as jobs. The jobs in PowerShell is actually does couple of things. A job in PowerShell means you can use jobs to make PowerShell multitasking, which means I'll demonstrate what I mean by that. And you can also run jobs remotely and also using background jobs, right? Remote jobs and background jobs, a couple of different things. So I want to talk about these two different things, and then we can actually have a pretty high level overview of the complete PowerShell remoting concept itself. So when I say get child item C:/request. So generally when I run this command, you and me obviously know that this command is going to run for a lot of time, right? No, why? Get child item C:/request. So maybe I don't have a lot of files. C:, maybe slash Oh, there we go. There are a lot of listing files that's happening, and things run so on, so on, and so on for a long period of time. And I need to wait until this command is executed and the display is actually stopped showing that output. So I cannot use this PowerShell copy as long as this particular task is running. As long as this particular task is running. So now I'm halting this for a reason so that I can demonstrate what I mean by jobs. So jobs are actually running things in the background, letting PowerShell make things in the background while you can use the PowerShell console in the foreground, right? So PowerShell does these things in a pretty decent way. For example, start job is a commandlet. Again, I'm actually looking for use, but let's as a best practice, when you're using a new thing, just stick to get command noun and show me all things that has a word job. So a couple of things that we are interested in right now. I am interested in get job, receive job, remove job, resume job, start job, stop job, and we'll talk about wait job. A couple of things we'll talk about at this point. So same command, when I use it as a job, start job, and then give it a script block, get child item c colon slash request. This is the same commandlet, but this time I'm asking PowerShell to run it as a job. And I hit enter. I get immediately the output back on the console saying that, boss, yeah, I'm doing the work in the background. You can use this PowerShell in the foreground while I'm doing that for you. So this is the job ID. That's the job ID number 10. PowerShell automatically creates a job name, job 10. And you can also give your own name if you would like to. The type of the job is background job. It's running in the background. The state of the job is running. Has more data is true, which means it has some data to show me back. So it has more data. And then it is running on the local host. So the start job commandlet is designed to run on the local machine itself. So it cannot run it on the remote machine using the start job what you call the command. So this is designed to run background jobs or locally on the machines. We'll talk about how to run it on the remote machines at a later point of time, but start job essentially is designed to run a particular job on the local machine. Fair enough. So if you want to see what are the jobs that are running on your machine, you can always say get job. Get job says, okay boss, you have job number ID which is running background on this particular local host machine, and it is still running. The state is still running, and it has data to show you. That's fine. Now the point is how this is working. When I open the task manager and look for the details and then see for PowerShell processes, as you can see here, this PowerShell process, when I said to run this as a job, it opened another PowerShell process. And it is started doing things, right? Started doing the things in that PowerShell copy. As you can see here, the memory of this PowerShell copy is creeping up as it is collecting the data of all the directory listing in the C drive. As you can see, that's happening. That's still happening. So if I want to stop this operation, I can just say stop job, and I can then give ID number 10, whatever the ID is. So currently the state of the job is stopped, as you can see, but it has more data to show me, which means till that point when I stop this job, whatever the data that is collected, PowerShell is buffered it in its memory and it is ready to display. But for me to see the display, I want to ask PowerShell to show me whatever you have collected so far. I say receive job, and then I'll give the ID number, which is 10. There we go. This is all I collected so far while you stop this operation. So this is a lot of information again. Now, so this is one thing, and the other thing that I want to show you now is once I asked PowerShell to show me the data that it collected, and the has more data column now changed to false because it showed me all the data it collected. So it no longer stores that information. It no longer stores that information in its memory, so I cannot again say receive job ID number 10. No, I cannot do that because PowerShell already showed me whatever it has. It has nothing to show now because it erased everything up from the memory once it is displayed. But I can do something else though. I can actually trigger the job one more time to see how to overcome that situation. Start job, yeah, recurse, and then again I can now say stop job using the same commandlet that I triggered before. Stop job ID number is 12 this time. It's stopped currently, so I can see that get job status is stopped, ID number 12, it is stopped, has more data is true. I can now say receive job ID number 12, but this time I'm gonna specify a parameter called keep. When I say keep to PowerShell displays all the information onto the console, fine, but still it keeps hold of the data. It still keeps hold of the data, so the has more data column still says true. So again I can say receive job ID number 12. It still shows me that information. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's a remote background job. But I want to do the same thing with remoting because we are talking about remoting, so we want to do this thing with remoting as well. So how do I do that? Invoke command, and then you can tell invoke command using the session or using the computer name parameters, right? ADFS01 comma web server, and then script block is get child item, and then C:/, and then I say recurse, but this time I tell to run it as a job, and then I can also actually give a name, I believe, or job name, whatever it is, job name. I can send remote directory, and then execute. PowerShell again immediately gives me the job ID number. This time this is job ID number 14. Remote directory is the name that I've given to the job, and this time the job type is not a background job. This time it is a remote job because I'm running on a remote computer. The state of the job is running, has more data is true, and these are the two servers on which I'm running, and this is the command letter that I have triggered. Again I can use the same commands, get job, to get all the list of jobs, job number 14. Now there is an important thing that I want to make you to pay attention. So get job ID number 14 is going to get me only the 14th job that I'm asked for, but if you see here, these are actually two jobs which are actually running, right? Two different jobs. PowerShell actually keeps track of them as a child jobs. As you can see here, the 14th actually is the parent job, but the actual jobs are 15 and 16 which are doing things. So it creates something called as child jobs in the background, and this parent jobs responsibility is to keep track of these two jobs, and then once they are done it shows the information or the status as completed. So currently the 15 and 16 is still running, so the state of this particular thing is still running. Now let's say if I say stop the job ID number 16, currently the job is stopped. Now if I say get job, the get job status 14 is still showing running and true. Again, if I say get job ID includes child job, the 16th job I asked it to stop, so it stopped. 15th job is still running, and the 14th job, that's the parent job which is tracking all these two jobs information, true jobs information. I can say stop job ID number 14. So I'm stopping the parent job, which means I'm triggering a stop action on 15 and 16, but 16 is already stopped, so there is no action, so 15 is going to get stopped. Now I can say receive job. I can receive jobs individually, like child jobs, ID number 15, ID number 16, and so on. ID number 16. I can get the information, or alternatively I can also call the parent job directly, so which displays all the information about the child jobs as well. Receive job ID number 14 is going to get all the information. It's going to get all the information. So these are the remoting jobs. So quite useful. Sometimes it becomes handy, and there is a lot of things that you can do. And again, if you want to know more, always go back to the help documentation. So once you get job, you get all the list of jobs, you can always pipe that to remove job, to remove all the jobs. So when I say get job, once again I get nothing back. I get nothing back onto my console. So these are the jobs. So where did we actually find the documentation about it? You can also always look about help, about the remoting. You can talk about help, about underscore remote. It talks about remoting, how to start an interactive session, how to exit PS session. I think there are a couple of commandlets which has computer name parameter, right? So these computer name parameter commandlets use the native remoting, which means it works under RPC. This works under RPC protocol, and the parameters that supports the session value, the dash session value, the dash session parameter, right? As we have seen, these things uses the WSMAN, the new protocol, the Windows Web Services Management Web Service Management Protocol, which is implemented by the WinRM service, and quite important to understand the concepts of this. Again, a lot of theory you can always read, storing things in variables, using them as a sessions, and then you can also learn about jobs right there. Help about underscore jobs talks about start job, receive job, stop job. Invoke command can be used to do jobs. We did learn how invoke command can be executed to run a particular job. And then receive jobs, and some examples of how to use the keep parameter, and some examples of how to actually store them as a variables, and so on and so forth. Finally, I want to just show one last thing to you, which is the implicit remoting concepts, or I want to also talk about the PS session configurations. So there is a command called get PS session configuration on the PowerShell. So you can just run this PS session configuration. So as you can see here, there are a couple of endpoints. These are called as endpoints. What it means is you need to understand how the remoting thing works. So let me just scroll up. So when you on a computer enable PowerShell remoting, there are a couple of things that happens. The first thing that happens is it starts the WinRM service. We already saw that. It creates firewall rules for the traffic to flow. And the third thing it does, it set permissions. Now the remoting flow works like this. So WSMAN actually creates something called as a listener on this machine. A listener is always listening for the 80 and 443 traffic in this case, right? The WSMAN traffic. So when I try to connect to a remote machine, that request is actually sent to this listener. That listener actually catches that information, and it passes that information to the WinRM service, and the WinRM service passes that to the PowerShell remoting, the PowerShell engine, or whatever it is. So the listener should always communicate with an endpoint. So these are the endpoints that actually it creates, PowerShell creates. So as you can see here, Microsoft.PowerShell is an endpoint. There is a concept called workflows in PowerShell which uses this particular endpoint. And if you are familiar with Windows administration, there is something called as server manager. So for server manager, PowerShell uses these workflows. So how do I actually tell this? So for example, let's open server manager. From server manager, I can actually I can from a local server, or I can actually connect to multiple servers, right? I can create a server group, so I can add multiple different servers, like server group name is my group, and then I can say filter or active directory. I can search for the server names, for example ADF 01, and then I can actually select that and I can add it to the pool, and then I can say web server, and I can select that and add it. So now I have a group, right? The group is getting created, but I have a group to manage. So which means from this server manager, I can add or remove roles on those local machines. So as you can see here, this is a group. I can right click and say add roles and features, restart the servers. So I'm sending some instructions from this server manager to that particular server manager. How this thing is working in the background. In the background, the server manager is using this remoting endpoint to pass the instructions to the remote machine via PowerShell. So this is how the server manager actually works, sending the information from one machine to another machine. It can install roles, restart servers, remove roles, and so on and so forth. And these are the 32-bit PowerShell endpoint. When you connect from 32-bit machine, this is for a 64-bit machine, normal PowerShell remoting, right? What we did so far, enable PS remoting, enter PS session, invoke command, and all this stuff worked on this particular endpoint. And as I said, there is a concept called workflows which uses this particular endpoint. So if you see these endpoints are assigned some sort of permissions who are allowed to connect. So as you can see here, the built-in administrators, right, which means the people who are part of the local administrator group can actually connect directly to this machine, and also the persons who are part of, there is a group called remote management users allowed in Active Directory. So if this particular group on the machine itself, so if this particular group is if I'm part of this particular group, I should be able to actually connect to that particular machine. And if you see here, for the server manager workflows, built-in administrator access is allowed, interactive acted is allowed. So only these two group of peoples can connect to this endpoint. No one can establish a remoting connection on this endpoint to that particular machine, to my machine. Only these groups are allowed. So similarly, the workflows are designed to be actually configured by someone who can connect to this machine. So these are PS session configurations. So you can also create your custom endpoint. You can create custom endpoints and assign permissions to specific users. So if you are familiar with some of the topics in the industry at this point, like just enough administration and just in time administration, these two things are actually a way of restricting people who can connect your machine remotely. And though they can connect a machine remotely, and you are restricting the ability of what commandlets they can run, what modules they can import, you can be as precise as you want. So these just enough administration uses something called as PowerShell endpoints for the end user to connect. And this is really important. We'll talk about that endpoint custom session configurations in a later video. But if you are interested to see what this custom endpoints are, there are actually, you can look for commandlets help, like get help on new PS session configuration, right, file, and this is going to give you a list of examples and descriptions of what it does, and then you can find some examples as well. So essentially, you're creating some kind of configuration file and then registering that configuration to create an endpoint, and then you will specify access. You can do it in multiple different ways. We can do it via role capability files, and you can also do it via the normal way of doing the custom session configuration definitions and all those stuff. But the point of this discussion is, I want to just give you a glimpse of it, but I don't want to actually demonstrate that in this particular video, because that's a complete different aspect in terms of remoting. So the video is actually built to provide you a high level understanding of how the PowerShell remoting works, what are the ports, protocols, and so on and so forth. This is super important to understand. So with that said, we actually covered a lot, right? This is a long video, so we covered about remoting in depth. We covered about topics like jobs, how to create a persistent temporary sessions or persistent sessions, entropy session, storing the session configurations, and all the stuff. So that's all I have for this video. If you like this video, please do like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and it encourages me to do more and more videos for you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.